All right, guys, today we're jumping into chapter 5 of Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, where we're starting off with emotions as a product of ideas. Stay tuned. All right, so Leonard starts off this chapter by really stressing that for objectivism, it only has one piece of advice, which is follow reason, but that historically, this doesn't give you much information because, historically, philosophers have really battled over what is the meaning of reason and what would it mean to follow it. From the objectivist perspective, we've gotten now the basic meaning of reason when we've examined that reason is the faculty that identifies and integrates the material provided by the senses. So it operates by the senses using concepts by the method of logic. And so the question is, all right, what's left? Well, first of all, we need to know, is reason our only means of knowledge? And then we have to understand, well, what does it actually give us? Does it give us knowledge? Does it give us certainty? Or does it just give us kind of tentative gropings? And so in order to answer that question, we're going to start off by talking about emotions as products of ideas. And the basic point here is that every other competitor for reason really reduces to feelings. And so we have to understand what feelings, what emotions are. And so we get that from the objectivist perspective, emotions are the products of ideas, that they're based on value judgments, on intellectual judgments that are automatized in our subconscious. And this is to be contrasted with what you could think of as sensations, meaning, I think Leonard gives the example of like getting poked with something sharp or something hot, and it doesn't matter whether you're a communist or it doesn't matter what your ideas are, you are going to feel pain. You're going to feel a certain kind of sensation. But that's not true when it comes to emotions. That emotions, you have a perception, you identify something, you judge it, and then you feel something. And that what is going on is that the two middle steps of identification and value judgments are often automatized and we're not fully aware of them. And so he gives some examples of how different people making different identifications and different judgments will have a different emotional reaction to the same object. And precisely because these value judgments and identifications are automatized, we're not fully aware of them, it's possible to have a conflict or a seeming conflict between our ideas and our emotions. But what that really amounts to is a clash between the ideas that we're holding consciously and subconscious ideas. It's idea conflicts. And therefore, these can be resolved because ultimately all of our ideas come from our mind. And so we can think about what is the correct evaluation here, and over time align our ideas and our emotions. And this puts objectivism in a completely different camp from all of the philosophies that preach some variant of the mind-body dichotomy. All of them say that there's an inherent clash between reason and emotion, and that in effect that they're two different metaphysical pieces of us pulling us in different directions. And objectivism says that's not true. There are no necessary clashes between reason and emotion. And so we can have a fully integrated way of living. We can live by reason because there's not this foreign element in us tugging against reason. So I want to talk for a minute about this idea that's really stressed in objectivism, that emotions are not tools of cognition. And you might think, well, why do people think that they might be tools of cognition? And I think there's a real parallel to perception, and that with emotions, what you have is automatic awareness. But from objectivism's perspective, it's not automatic awareness of an object. It's automatic awareness of your evaluation of your identification of an object. That what you're getting is automatized access to your values, not to external reality. And so I think the way that Nathaniel Branden defines emotions when he's writing with Ayn Rand is something like it's a psychosomatic form in which we're automatically aware of our values. In fact, let me just get the exact definition because I think it's really good. An emotion is the psychosomatic which just means mind and body, form in which man experiences his estimate of the beneficial or harmful relationship of some aspect of reality to himself. And so it's when you're having an emotional experience, it's that you have an identification and you have an evaluation, and both of those are fallible. Both of those are judgments that can be right or wrong. And there's kind of several ways actually that an emotion can go wrong, in the sense of it's not giving you what you would fully endorse if you made everything explicit and judged it objectively. So one is you could just misidentify the object, right? Like you could have an emotional reaction because you think like, oh man, somebody I don't like just walked into the room, and then it's, oh no, I didn't, that's not that person. Or to go to the kind of example that Leonard gives, you're a scientist who sees a slide of, a disease, and you think, oh man, this person has cancer. And then you look at it more closely and go, oh no, actually this is very likely benign. Or you find out that, the person who has cancer is Hitler, and you're like, all right, that's pretty cool. But so you can have an identification that's wrong. You can have the value judgment itself is wrong, and you think, yeah, I don't agree with that judgment. Like, I'm having this kind of negative experience. I'm perceiving, my emotions are telling me this is bad for me, but I think it's really good. So if you can think about Reardon and Atlas Shrugged, he has this feeling that, his attraction to Dagny, she seems to be a real positive, his feelings are telling him, but his mind is telling him, no, this is wrong. I made a promise to my wife, and he has this conflict. But then there's a final way that you can go wrong, which is that your emotions can just get things out of context. And one of the examples Brandon gives that I thought was really illuminating here is he talks about, a guy is introduced to a woman, the guy's married, and for a moment he has kind of, sexual attraction to her, and thinks in kind of a fleeting thought of, oh, that would be, amazing to have an affair. But then he brings the full context back, including what it would cost him and how much he loves his wife, and that desire disappears. And the kind of Christian way of processing that is, oh, there's evil in me and I need to beat myself over the back. From the objectivist perspective, it's no, you have out of context emotions all the time. And if you don't act on them, if you bring back the full context and go on with your life, like there's nothing wrong with those emotions. So it's that the basic issue with emotions is that they have no ability to by themselves assess their connection to reality. And we can integrate this with free will, which I find really useful. So if you remember when we talked about free will, it's that free will is the area where you have direct control over the use of your mind, and that you need that direct control if your conceptual level, if a fallible part of your mind is to be able to be in contact with reality. You have to be able to assess and say, is this fallible piece actually getting the facts right? And if you couldn't do that, if you were determined, then you couldn't claim anything as knowledge, because you would have no way to directly put your mind in contact with reality. And so with emotions, you have control over them, but it's indirect control. It's that over time, you can shape your emotions by introspecting and assessing your subconscious value judgments. And there's more to say about that. I'll say a little bit more in this, but it's a little oversimplifying to put it that way. But you do have this indirect control, but you cannot directly control and say, all right, I'm going to have my emotions follow my reason and just do that as a matter of willpower. And so in effect, what emotions are is what it would be like to be determined, where you have a perception and then an automatic kind of awareness that you have no way of assessing whether it's in contact with reality, and it can depart from reality. So with emotions, there's always this question of, all right, are they getting reality right? And you can't check that using emotion. Your emotions aren't going to tell you whether or not your emotion is right or wrong. That can only be done by reason, the thing that you actually have direct control over. And in a certain way, it's, if you want to put it, worse than that, because it's not just that your emotions can't check their own relationship to reality. It's that your emotions, and I think this is universal, but is at least usually true, that your emotions encourage you to find evidence of their own validity. And this is true even of kind of negative emotions. Like if you think when you're angry and in an argument, part of what your emotions are urging you to do is find reasons to justify that anger. And even if you take something that like a person really wants to escape, because there can be a certain pleasantness of anger, which is interesting. But if you take something like anxiety, which people really want to escape, even there, kind of anxious thought patterns and feelings, even if you're kind of consciously trying to work yourself out of them, the emotions are kind of urging you to look for, no, there's real threats and there's real things to be concerned about here. And so there's one of the consequences of this, and this is why I want to stress it, we'll talk more about this when we talk about the arbitrary, is that your emotions, to be acting on emotion and to be thinking in the grips of an emotion does not mean that you don't have reasons and that you can't spew out reasons. That a person who's fundamentally driven by emotion in thought or in action often can articulate quite a few reasons, but it's reasons selected in effect by the emotions to justify the emotions, not by the mind in order to get reality right. And so I think this is really valuable just to understand about emotions, is that the mere fact that you can kind of give reasons to justify something doesn't by itself mean that you're going by reason. Reason means that, no, I'm going by an objective method, or at least once you're aware of method, of objectivity, that's what it means. It's that, no, I'm going by a certain method, and I'm part of the method is being aware of it's really easy to be biased and selective in the kind of evidence we'll consider, and to try to rationalize, try to justify something that I want to be true because of a given emotion, versus being on the premise of, no, I'm really trying to get at what is true. And so again, we'll talk about more about this when we get to the arbitrary, because one of the things we'll see with the arbitrary is that even when people are being arbitrary or are promoting an arbitrary idea, there can be a facade of reasons to it. And that's really crucial to understand about the way that emotionalism actually functions. That it's very rare that you just go have somebody be an outright emotionalist and not have any sort of kind of justification aspect to it. Now, having said all of that about emotions, let's really stress that this is not meant to denigrate emotions. To say that they're not tools of cognition is not to say that they're bad or wrong or anything like that. I remember, I think in Understanding Objectivism, though I may be wrong about that, Leonard Peikoff made a point, something to the effect of like there's many things that aren't tools of cognition, like your digestion is not a tool of cognition, but it's pretty damn important. And so what's being stressed is that like emotions are not giving you, are not putting you in touch with reality, ensuring that you're connected to reality, but they're hugely valuable. They give you, first of all, a reward and incentive to pursue values. The way that we experience life as an end in itself is emotions. That's like the cash value of achieving a value and pursuing a value. And you need that in order to motivate you to go out there and pursue values. But even more than that, emotions can, not more than that, but in addition to that, emotions can be aids to thinking if you use them properly. So emotions are kind of lightning-like calculations. And if you think about them, if they're a species of a broader phenomenon of automatized awareness or automatized content from your subconscious. And automatization is hugely valuable in thinking. So you can think there's a whole category of things you can call cognitive emotion. So if you're reading something, you might consciously not see any flaws in it, but you get an uneasy feeling. This is particularly true if you edit your work or other people's work. You'll have a sense that you can't quite name of, yeah, there's something that's not quite right here. There's something that's not quite clear. And it can take real effort then to make that explicit, to make it fully articulated and rational. But it's a huge lead. And if you think about, for example, meeting a new person, and sometimes you'll get an uneasy feeling. And if you ask yourself, well, I can't name anything about the person exactly that's making me uneasy, you're still getting information in very subtle ways that you're not fully conscious of, and your emotions are giving you like a lead to, well, look very carefully before you decide to kind of pursue any kind of relationship with this person. But there's even, I found that in complicated sorts of situations, emotions can be really good at getting you to the essential of what's really the crux of the issue. And I noticed this, it's very related to the issue of rationalism. I noticed this, and there were certain kind of like difficult personal controversies that were occurring amongst people that I knew a while back. And the kind of people who are prone to rationalism, and many intellectuals, there is this phenomenon of like, it just seems so complex. This person said this and did this, and this person said that and did that, and how are you going to put it together? And here's 10 different considerations. And then I remember talking to my wife, and to her, like, the whole situation was obvious and common sense. And part of it is just that issue of like being in touch with your emotions and them kind of drawing out, yeah, this is the real crux of the issue. All of what you guys are doing is secondary. Like, it reminded me of there's certain issues that I would try to write about that, like, I knew I was clear on what the right answer was, but I found it hard to defend. And so the kinds of things I would write were just very academic, like on the one hand and on the other, but on balance. So I have in mind specifically here issues related to paternalism and this idea of like, well, shouldn't the government nudge us to do what's good for us? And I thought, well, no, that's wrong. But it seemed very hard to defend that when it came to something like if you took, cigarette smoking, and it's, well, yeah, I mean, this is deadly. But on the other hand, like, people should be free, and it just, I guess you could have property rights, but what about secondhand smoke? And I guess people voluntarily, it was just all of this stuff on the table. And I remember Ankar Gate was kind of talking to us in a meeting. I think this later turned up in some form in a talk he gave. But it was like, what should your reaction be if somebody comes along and says, well, no, I know what's good for you, and I'm going to, regulate and control you to do what's good for you. And it was, the way he put it was F you. And I think the way he actually put it in the speech, and I think this is Atlas Shrugged, America's Second Declaration of Independence, was, can you imagine Thomas Jefferson allowing somebody to tell him that he couldn't have like a trans fat filled treat or something like that? And it was just activating that kind of common sense attitude that a person would have if they weren't just getting lost in a sea of rationalistic ideas. And so these things can really help you zero in on difficult, complex issues, but then you still have to validate it with your mind. So one of the things I want to draw your attention to in what Leonard wrote is, and I think a lot of people skip over, is he really stresses this idea that emotions are based not on kind of like a single evaluation, but a chain of evaluations. And he indicates, we're going to talk about this more in chapter 12, which, if you peek on the index or look ahead, is art, which should be intriguing. But it's that the chain of evaluations is, one way to think about it is, if you study cognitive behavioral therapy, there's this idea that we don't just have, there's this idea that they have a view of emotions is very similar to objectivism's, where emotions come from evaluations, that they will put it in, you have automatic thoughts that are kind of underlying and leading to certain emotional states, but that your automatic thoughts come from a deeper place, and they'll break it down in different ways. But in some treatments, all you get is that there's automatic thoughts and then there's emotions. But for instance, in Judith Beck's work, Judith Beck was the daughter of Aaron Beck, who founded cognitive behavioral therapy. She talks about how there's intermediate thoughts, or intermediate beliefs that are feeding these automatic thoughts, and then underlying those, what she calls core beliefs. And this is going to be very similar to how objectivism thinks about it. So just to give you an example from cognitive behavioral therapy, and again, this is my understanding, I'm not an expert on CBT, but I found this very illuminating when I read it. So this is taking an example from her. She has a student feel sad after reading a textbook on a college course she just started. Well, why is she sad? And it's because this experience is being run through a network of beliefs. So this girl in question is a core belief, I'm incompetent. And then that's mediated by certain intermediate beliefs that it's terrible to be incompetent. If I work extra hard, I can do okay. If I don't work hard, I'll fail. And then it gives rise to a specific automatic thought that's going to trigger this depressed state. I can't do this. This is too hard. I'll never learn this all. And so part of what you want to be able to do as you're thinking about your emotions is over time, learn to trace them back through from the automatic thought to the intermediate beliefs down to the core beliefs that are going to shape and color all of your emotions. And this is similar to the way that Objectivism thinks about it, that you don't just have these kind of isolated evaluations, but this, you can think about it as a hierarchy of evaluations rooted in certain core beliefs, if you want to call it that. Now, the way CBT thinks about core beliefs, and I just want to make sure that I get this right, is that they have it as, or at least Judith Beck puts it as, your core beliefs are your fundamental beliefs about your efficacy, lovability, and worthiness. And now from Objectivism's perspective, those are aspects of self-esteem, but that there's an even deeper, or let's call it a wider set of fundamental beliefs that are going to shape your emotional states. And the way that Ayn Rand will conceptualize this is as metaphysical value judgments. It's your fundamental beliefs at a preconceptual level that about man existence and man's relationship to existence that's going to shape in part your self-esteem, although it's more complicated than that because there's a way in which your self-esteem is sort of formed and shaping those metaphysical value judgments, I think. But that you have this wider implicit philosophy. So it's not just an evaluation of yourself, but it's an evaluation of yourself and the world and your relationship to the world and to other men and to man's nature. All of that is the kind of foundational pieces that are going to color all of your other emotional reactions. And that's really important to know because ultimately when you're dealing with real psychological challenges, and I don't mean kind of like ones that need to be treated by medicine or that really take you apart from reality. So we're not talking about somebody who's schizophrenic, but the kind of like real struggles with anxiety and depression that people have and the ways that people cope with these difficult emotions, whether it's, certain like obsessive compulsive behaviors or, addictions or repression. There's a whole manner of which people try to cope with difficult emotional states that from Objectivism's perspective, that you're often you're usually dealing with ideas rooted in your kind of core beliefs about yourself and the world. And so in order to correct your emotions, it's not correcting your a specific evaluation or a specific automatic thought, but a core kind of evaluation that's shaping many, many automatic thoughts and emotional states. So I want to start off with some practical advice, and I'll relate it to the kind of the practical advice that we gave when we talked about knowledge as contextual and integration and knowledge as hierarchical and reduction. So if you remember, borrowing from Greg Salmieri, we talked about, in effect, kind of like common sense integrations, and it's just asking yourself, what is this similar to? What is this different from? And then common sense or kind of a first take or, one or two step reductions where you just say, why do I think this is true? And you go down one or two levels until you feel on more solid ground, as distinguished from like the fully rigorous, methodical step-by-step all the way, integrating with the sum total of your knowledge and reducing all the way down to perception, which it's not that that's wrong, but you can think about it as, well, how do you get there? And it's having an ongoing policy over time of doing these just kind of first take into question asking that puts you on the path towards integrating and towards reducing. And as you make it part of your life, you'll find that you're going deeper and deeper and connecting things more and more. And I think there's something similar to be said about introspection and learning to be more at home in your emotional life and more aware, and ultimately be able to identify and, if necessary, try to make some corrections to any core beliefs or metaphysical value judgments that are shaping your emotional states in ways that you don't consciously endorse and that you think are wrong. And so my basic piece of advice is to just start naming the kind of most obvious inner states that you're experiencing. And so this could be like, well, I'm thinking about this and I'm a little confused. You're conceptualizing these things. And then when we're talking about emotions more specifically, it's just naming the emotion and naming everything associated with the emotion that comes to mind. So for example, it's like, well, I'm feeling angry and I feel kind of tension in my chest, and I keep having this like, automatic string of thoughts. Maybe it's visual. I keep seeing X, Y, Z over and over in my head. And you're just describing your inner world, because it's shocking how disconnected you can be from that inner world. And so now for some of you, this might just feel like obvious and pointless. But I mean, it wasn't for me. So, I mean, one of the things that I've experienced, and maybe some of you have too, but like my wife would say to me at times, like, you seem really like angry or annoyed or something like that. And I'd say, no, I'm fine. And then like half an hour later, I'd realize, oh no, I really was, like upset about something, and I wasn't even aware of it. And so you can become more familiar and in touch with these emotional states. And if you just think about, like, it's a mistake to try to just, all right, I'm going to get to the root of all of my issues and emotions and underlying premises. That can be overwhelming. You're kind of setting yourself up for failure. But I mean, one of the things I did is I realized part of the challenge for me is I didn't even have a really good emotional vocabulary. Like, apart from, the 4 or 5 most obvious sorts of emotions like anger, love, hate, there was not a lot of conceptualization that I really had gone through there. And so one of the things I did is I got just a printout of different emotions, and there's a lot of different lists that you can find online, and sometimes they'll be organized and they'll have definitions, or I mean, ideally you have kind of the universal judgment that's underlying each one of these emotions. And it's just to start to build up a conceptual vocabulary for emotions and identify them with yourself. And then I think if you do that over time, you can become more and more aware of your inner states, and then I think get to more and more foundational issues. And so, I think a good starting point is just naming things, naming those states. And then if you want more specific advice, I mean, certainly if there's something really serious in your life, and even if there's not, I'm very big on like, go find, a good therapist, go find a good psychologist. I think that can be really life-changing. And it's shocking to me that, I think in a better culture, that would be as common as like, all right, you go for your annual checkup with your medical doctor. Well, you should go for at least your annual checkup, with a psychologist, of like, just check how are things going. So I'm very big on that. But I think there's, once you're kind of going through these steps of getting more familiar with your inner states, the kind of next steps that I found very valuable, let me put it that way, are I mentioned CBT, and particularly the ideas of Judith Beck. And the book I read from hers that is my favorite is, she has this book, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy, Basics and Beyond, I think 2nd edition. And there's just a lot of gold in there. And in particular, like actual steps that you can take in order to get deeper and deeper into identifying the kind of network of assumptions, beliefs, and values that are giving rise to your emotional states. And then I think certain steps that you can do to deal with them. Another guy who's, I think you could say CBT influenced, but has kind of his own additions and methods, is a guy named David Burns. Am I getting that right? David Burns. He wrote a book, Feeling Good. He wrote a book on anxiety that I liked actually a lot better. And he did a podcast later on that I think even had more advanced ideas that might not even be in his books. There's also a guy whose name I'm going blank on, but Alex Epstein did an interview with him for Human Flourishing Human Flourishing podcast, Brent. In fact, let's take a brief timeout while I find out his name. Yeah, so for the Human Flourishing podcast, Alex did an interview with a guy named Brent Charlton, and he has some really interesting ideas, and kind of it comes at psychology from a different angle, but his work is really fascinating and I think has a lot to say. Edith Packer, she gave a bunch of lectures that I think you can still buy, but you can definitely buy. They were transcribed into, I think, an ebook that you can get on Amazon. And I found those really clarifying. At least they had some really valuable ideas that I haven't found anywhere else. And so that's just kind of like a starting point. This is, I want to stress, not an area where I'm an expert. It's kind of an area where I'm actively trying to learn. And these are just resources that I found particularly helpful. And in particular, if you're just trying to understand the objectivist view, I think CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has the most parallels. Although, again, there are differences. So I don't want to, I think it's important not to totally equate them, but it's just fascinating how on the frontier Ayn Rand was as a philosopher to some of the most respected psychology that and most well-tested psychology that we know of. All right, one final point before signing off, which is it's really important not to judge your emotions, or at least to be really clear what we mean when judging your emotions. Your emotions aren't chosen, and the way you judge yourself are by your choices. Now, they reflect past choices that you've made, and that's important to know, and that's valuable to know. But one shouldn't have a kind of like worried, guilty feeling of, oh my God, did I have a right emotion or wrong emotion, in that sort of way. Rather, the attitude should be one of like understanding and enjoyment, and not a kind of like my self-esteem is on trial for do I get the right emotions. It's that I want to understand them. I want to understand the evaluation. I want to think, do I endorse that evaluation? And am I going to act on that kind of evaluation? But it should be just a kind of enjoyment, for the most part, enjoyable process of understanding and using the kind of information that our emotions give us access to, and then the rewards that they give us. So it's not that you don't think about your emotions and try to understand them, but what I just want to stress is that you're not doing it from a place of what does it say about me that I had this emotion. That is the kind of like Christian, oh, you have lust in your heart. Well, that's as bad as committing adultery. Like that is the complete opposite of the objectivist view of I had this emotion. That's kind of weird. I wonder where that came from. And I understand it. And if I endorse it, then I move forward. And if I don't, then I correct it and say, no, I disagree with that, and make a commitment to, no, this is the way I'm going to try to look at the world going forward. So with that, we are done with this section. Stay tuned next time where we'll continue talking about Chapter 5, Reason. If you enjoy this video, be sure to like it, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and hit that bell so you do not miss an episode. And as always, the best way to stay in contact is to go to donswriting.com and sign up for the newsletter. Talk next time.